and AC. Let's talk about energy for a second. For the past couple of months, ERCOT has been under the microscope because we're wondering, hey, with all these heat waves, energy production has gone up in Texas, or energy consumption has gone up in Texas, and we're wondering, what do we do about extra sources of power? And the thing came to mind, what about nuclear? When was the last time we talked about nuclear, right?
We have a nuclear reactor in Texas.
But what makes it so difficult to put up a new one is the question, Davis.
Good question.
And so Jeff Luse is a policy assistant at the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, a.k.a. C3. He's got a neat article in thenationalinterest.org titled, "It's Time to Modernize America's Nuclear Power Policy." So why is it a rare occurrence that we see a nuclear power plant going up?
Yeah. Hi, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, nuclear, it's an often, under discussed option for clean energy, but it's a really important one. And as I mentioned in my article on the national interest, one of the biggest things, it's economics, but that, makes it unaffordable to build nuclear, but the economics are driven by outdated government regulations that really just inflate costs, bloat projects, and just, make it really undesirable to build nuclear in some cases.
Give us an idea of what that process looks like, because to us it just sounds like stacks and stacks of paperwork and red tape.
I mean, you're not too far off there. Yeah, so before, any project has to be built, it has to receive approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has to be permitted, fill out all the environmental paperwork, all the environmental regulations before it can start getting built. And as we saw with Vogtle 3 in Georgia, which is the most recent nuclear power plant to be built and to, deliver energy to the grid, it's the first one in over 30 years in the U.S. What really just pushes it back is, red tape. So, for instance, Vogtle 3, they had to undergo different amendments, different licensing things with the NRC, and that just takes, a while to complete. It takes a lot to do. There's high costs with compliance. So, what ends up happening with many projects, it gets pushed back as much as 6 years and billions of dollars over budget. And, in the article, I point out a few things that has to do with that inflates the cost. One of them is quality assurance and quality compliance standards. So that basically the regulations that came about primarily in the 60s and 70s, and they came about from an overreaction to 3 Mile Island, which, of course, was the worst nuclear accident that happened to the U.S., but led to exactly 0 radiation-caused deaths. It didn't even increase cancer rates in the area. But what these QA and QC standards require is for a nuclear power plant to be built, the steel and the cement that goes into the power plant has to fulfill certain criteria and certain paperwork. But the issue with that is that the safety that the added safety costs, it's essentially nothing compared to standard industrialized cement and steel. So it just increases the cost for no added safety benefit. So those are just a few of the issues that nuclear developers face.
Joining us on 710 KURV is Jeff Luse, who is with the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. We're talking about nuclear power and why it's not very often that you see a new nuclear power plant going up. Davis Rankin, go ahead with your question.
I believe that it's easier to permit a nuclear power plant in Europe than it is in the United States. Am I right about that? And if so, why is it easier?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends country to country. I mean, you're seeing it like France gets, 70% of their energy from nuclear. You're seeing countries like Poland, Czech Republic also embracing nuclear. So, yeah, it's easier just because the politics allow for it primarily. I mean, the physics and the history of nuclear power shows that it's the safest energy source that we have. So it's really not an issue of environmental regulation, or it is an issue of environmental regulation. It's not an issue of environmental safety as much as it is an issue of political willpower. So, like you see in France, many former Soviet countries, the government, they support nuclear power. They recognize that it's essential to meeting their A, their power needs, and B, their carbon reduction goals. So, they make it easier for developers to build, and which is something that really the U.S. needs to adopt.
Can you give an example? I'm calling on my memory from when the South Texas Nuclear Project went into existence about 30 years ago, and it was owned by then, I think, 5 different utility companies and cities that have their own utility company. And it took a long time, and they kept saying that the regulations would change. And the people who were opposed to all that painted a picture of people who were hostile to nuclear power managing to get the government to change things all the time so they could put something in, build something, and then have to take it all out because it didn't meet the new specs. And so it just drug on and on and on and went way over budget. Is that what's going on now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not familiar with that that case particularly. Yeah. I mean, you do see some uncertainties in terms of regulations. I mean, for instance, on the NEPA process, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, in order to conduct, to fulfill the environmental regulations, developers sometimes they're unsure, and that can change from administration to administration. Under the Trump administration, they clawed back some outdated NEPA regulations, only for the Biden administration to, claw back the clawback. Yeah. And then the same goes for the actual licensing process for nuclear power plants as well. It's unclear at times, it's uncertain at times, and that just confuses developers, which, like you said, it increases budgets, it increases project times.
Joining us on 710 KURV, Jeff Luse is with the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, and we're talking about why it takes so long to put up a new nuclear power plant. So let me ask this question in this particular way. So how do we acclimate people and educate people to get on board with nuclear power if it really is the strong, clean energy like we've been saying it is? And how do we kind of get the stigma out of people's heads that it's automatically going to be like the Chernobyl documentary on HBO?
Yeah, and there were definitely problems with that documentary. Yeah, that is an excellent question, and that's honestly one of the biggest challenges that the industry faces in the U.S. Fortunately, you are seeing some polling that shows that people are beginning to recognize the benefits and the inherent safety of nuclear energy. I think it was a few months ago it reached a decade high. It was around 60% of Americans approve. So that's definitely encouraging to see. And at the same time, you are starting to see a bit more bipartisanship on the issue. Historically, it was mostly a Republican-dominated issue. They had better ideas, but Democrats are starting to get on board. So we are starting to see some favorability to it, but really, I think in many cases it comes down to state policy. While the NRC and nuclear power plants broadly are regulated by, federal regulations, in certain cases, state governments have moratoriums on new builds. So it does come down to educating policymakers about the inherent safety of it. And it also comes down to just, pointing out what the rest of the world is doing with embracing it. But like I said, you are starting to see a bit more bipartisanship and a bit more common sense on the issue, especially as, innovations accelerate, like advanced reactors, SMRs, and, with those technologies, it seems that people are a bit less concerned about waste, even though I could argue that the nuclear waste really isn't the largest issue that nuclear power has. So it will be a conscious effort and a steady effort, really, on the part of think tanks, policymakers, educators, just to get the public on board with the whole thing.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for outlining everything for us. Appreciate your time here with us today. That's Jeff Luse with the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions.